What I'm going to show you today is not the only way to do anything. You all know that. We work in a development environment. By the way, my wife says the only exercise I get is when I speak. So I'm going to try to move around a little bit instead of being tethered to the chair. We work in a development environment, so we find different ways to do things. There's no single one right answer to solve a problem. If it works and it does what you need it to do, good, right? We move on and we do the next thing because there's always more work to do than we can possibly get done in a given day. What we've found is what works for us. And let me take you back on a little bit of a history. I'm a Unix guy. Before that, my first exposure to filePro was on a Model 2 with one floppy drive. And then we got the 3-bay expansion, and you could get a rhythm going. As the thing would read from each drive, only one at a time. There were 4 drives, but it could only read from one at a time. And when John mentioned that 2 megabyte card that you put into the back of the Model 2 so you could connect, actually the Model 16 then, so you could start connecting terminals, I remember soldering resistors onto the power supply so that I could maintain the proper voltage, because the cards drove more voltage than the system was designed for, which Radio Shack didn't apparently think about. We kept putting cards and things in the... Thank goodness we don't have to solder resistors onto the hardware anymore to make filePro work. But those original Profile 2 days, before we had Math 64, and I joked about this yesterday, you know, how many people paid money to have some custom work done by a small computer company, because we said we want more math, so they Math 64. The reports used to be only one-line reports. We needed full-page reports, so Special Forms was born. All of this stuff has grown so much over the years, and we're seeing a spurt of that again in the last few years. With Bud's direction and his team, there has been a lot that's happened with 5.7, 5.8, and now 6.0. So we've leveraged a lot of that. But we started on the Model 2. I started on the Model 2, then the Model 16, the Model 16B, and then Unisys machines running System 5 Release 4. How many people in the room still do Unix-based systems? I'm expecting to see just about everybody. How many of you are almost exclusively Windows-based systems? Okay, and I'm putting my hand up now too. We have one client still running Unix, and it's only because I haven't been able to get them to upgrade yet. As we were approaching Y2K, a couple of things started to happen. We work for county government. County IT departments didn't want to see Unix systems anymore. Now, wouldn't it be great if we could just deploy functionality-based systems and don't worry about how it works behind the scenes? Do you really worry about what operating system your phone has? Well, I guess that's not a bad example, because boy, you're either an Android or you're an Apple OS, but it's the functionality that should drive this. Over time, though, it's changed. People care about, oh, if it doesn't have a Microsoft sticker on it, that's a bad thing. Oh, filePro, that's that old DOS program, that's a bad thing. We're not going to hire you. We're not going to give you a $7 million reassessment contract because we don't like what your software's written in. And that's a very real problem that I'm sure you've all faced when you're trying to go in. And we've all done things to make it look better and to put a different face on it. And Patrick, your stuff yesterday that you demonstrated is obviously leveraging all this newest stuff, and it looks great. You don't know that's not filePro. And it's extending things that solve the problem of some of the appearance issues. Yeah. I don't need to preach into the choir if I were to say, show me another operating environment that has the event processing capabilities when entering field, when leaving field, the ability to do processing like scan processing when I'm generating reports, and move a lot of data around fast, than filePro. SQL Server is just a big repository to store stuff in. It's not a programming environment. You have to add stuff to SQL if you're going to program in it. It's not even a front end to do data entry. You got to use Visual Studio or other tools to create screens. And if you want to do report writing, you know, Crystal reports used to be the end-all be-all. Crystal went down the tubes. We switched to Telerik. But most for things that we had to do outside of filePro, all of this in one tool is why we're still using it. It's incredibly powerful, and the way it was engineered in the beginning is a testament to that, and the extensions are great. But we were getting beat up. We were getting beat up because they didn't want to be on Unix anymore. And they were getting beat up because we didn't have the ability to communicate with ODBC. And ODBC for filePro first came out for Windows. Wasn't supported on Unix in MySQL originally. I don't remember when it happened, but that came later. So that was the big day when we said all of our new deployments are going to be Windows-based, and that was a good start. And it worked for a while. But then Microsoft kept improving things and breaking stuff. So what I'm going to show you is what we have found the best practices are, with a little bit of history thrown in, but what works today. So I'm going to suggest and encourage any of you folks that are running Unix-based systems, get yourself a Windows development license if you don't have one, and play with it. The programming and the code is completely interchangeable between the two, so there's not anything there. But if you want to set up a Windows machine or a Windows server out of the box and not have to go through some of the pains and experimentation we did, this is a bit of a roadmap. So that's my goal, is to tell you what worked for us and introduce you to that. So the first thing is you got to have a good platform to run it on. And this is true for Unix too. There's a lot of overlap here, but in Windows it's even more important. Because let's face it, the Unix operating system and file systems are better managers than NTFS. We need good hardware, and the disk I/O is king. That is the most important thing. So you asked me during the breakfast about solid state versus hybrid drives and so forth. If you're running on physical drives, 15K drives is great. That's what you want to start with. You can't get a server with 15K drives anymore though, because they all want the little 2.5-inch ones. If you can't get 15K drives, get as many spindles as possible. In other words, as many physical drives as possible. We bought a server about 5 or 6 years ago, and it has 22 10K drives in it, in one big giant RAID 6 array. RAID 6 gives you double redundancy. You can lose 2 drives and your data's not gone. And it had 2 drives as a solid state accelerator. So 5, 6 years ago, that was the sort of state of the art. Well, you could spend bleeding edge money, but for normal people, that was the sweet spot. So as many spindles as possible. Why? Because it's like having more people doing the work. Every drive, if I'm reading a block of data and it's spread across all those drives, and they're 3 gig drives, the throughput, or the more modern 6 gig or even 12 gig, the more drives there are, the more communication paths there are, and so forth. You want to have RAID. You don't want to rely. You could do the mirror if you're on a PC. Use the new mirroring feature to put your core data on the D drive and a complete copy of it on an E drive, so that if one of the drives fails, you've got the other one. Or use Microsoft mirroring techniques if you want to do that too. But you want to have RAID, but make sure it has a battery in it. Battery-backed cache is important because if you're, and again, a lot of this overlaps with Unix, I realize that. If it doesn't have a battery, then the RAID controller is going to go into a slower mode. It will not be able to do write-back cache. And I'll try not to get too into the weeds here, but does anyone know the difference between write-back and write-through cache? Go ahead.
Write-back is essentially you're maintaining part of the data that would have gone back to the hard drives. You're maintaining it in RAID memory so that you've got really fast access to it. It's similar to a hybrid drive with SSD on it. So.
Exactly. Write back, if you're the RAID controller, the minute I give you the data and you're the hard drive, the minute I give you the data, you tell me you're done. I can go do something else. You'll take care of catching up, putting it to the disk when you get a chance. Write through, I got to wait for you to make sure you've written it to him before I'm allowed to go do what I want to do. So you see the delay that would introduce? You can't do write back unless you have a battery on your RAID controller. So when you're buying a server to do Windows, make sure it has a good RAID, a hardware RAID controller with battery back cache. SAS drives are better than SATA. They may have the same plug, but they're engineered to a different level. They have better throughput and the communications are better, so just trust me. I'm not saying you have to buy all enterprise class, but don't buy the nearline ones that are designed for long-term storage either. It's less of a problem if you got lots of spindles in RAID 6, because I can lose a drive if I don't mind replacing drives every once in a while. We've had to replace drives, everybody does. They will fail. It's not when they'll fail, it's, but they will eventually fail. Solid state drives are great. Our newest server that we bought 2 years ago, I think, has 24 solid state drives in a big giant RAID 6 array. Now, this is a Windows server running Hyper-V, so I can have 10, 20, 30 virtual servers. Both of those two servers I said are that way. And Jason will ping pong things back and forth between the two of them depending upon our load and what we want to do. So the solid state drives are good. You can do all solid state. You can just use a few as an accelerator, like that server I mentioned. And then there's these expensive hybrid systems. Storage area networks, things where it's all inside the server, it will cache and store what's busiest on faster memory or SSDs, and files that don't get touched in a while, it will automatically push to slower drives. And that costs more, but if you've got massive storage, you may eventually need to be at that point. Separate your boot and your data volumes. If Windows takes a leap off a cliff and has to be reinstalled, you don't want your data to go with it. So even though it's one big RAID array, you got a C drive for the operating system, don't put filePro on the C drive, put it on the D drive. So your filePro stuff should all be on one volume and the operating system on the other. So that's hardware. Virtualization. How many of you have used either Hyper-V or VMware? Okay, great. So I don't need to tell you a lot about it. For those of you that haven't, it's basically a concept where the hardware itself is running a core operating system, and on top of that you have virtual servers where the hard drive is a file, a VHDX file, for example. And you can adjust the memory up and down, and you can adjust the disk sizes up and down, and you can ping pong the whole server from one physical machine to another with a few clicks. You can replicate one server through the network to an offsite location using Windows tools. It's a management advantage. It's not as fast as running locally on dedicated iron. There is a performance penalty for putting virtualization in, but that's our standard, and all of our new clients, even if I have to buy the hardware and the Microsoft server license comes with the ability to do 2 virtual servers on it out of the box, you don't have to pay any extra for that. So our typical install is a Dell server with Microsoft server on it and 2 Hyper-V servers, one running my CAMA stuff and the other one is either usually a SQL server or a domain controller or something else. By the way, if you have questions, you're welcome to chime in as I run through this. So Hyper-V is Microsoft's flavor. VMware is a competitor to Microsoft. They're both good. They both work. You can do 2 hosts per physical server or more. 2 come standard. Allocate your servers wisely. SQL Server is a pig. It better be on its own machine. You can put SQL Server on the same machine that's storing all your filePro data, but you don't want to, because it will just gobble up memory when it wants to and other things. So give it its own virtual machine or its own physical machine if you're doing SQL Server is our recommendation. Domain controllers should be independent, but sometimes I can't afford that. So sometimes the domain controller and my filePro server will be one and the same. I can't tell you how many counties we've gone into that don't have a Windows domain. In fact, I was talking with, you don't need to raise your hand, someone here the other day that's still using Windows for Workgroups to share their files, to run their filePro over Windows for Workgroups. If you're running domain, that's not really what it's called anymore, but they're running unauthenticated shares with a user password, and that we all did that originally, but you don't get the security that you do from having a domain controller. And there's a lot of configuration. I was really intimidated with dealing with the domain controllers originally. So you know what I did? I found a local company half a mile away that installs domain controllers all day long, and I paid them per hour to help me set them up. And now we know how to do it, and we do it for other people. So that's the path of least resistance, because in the business world, people are setting up domain controllers all the time, and you can usually find local vendors that will help with that. Processor speed. filePro, at least in its current incarnation, correct me if I'm wrong, is not multi-threaded. So if I'm running an R clerk or an R report, it will attach itself to one core on that server. You all know that modern servers have multiple cores, 8 cores, 16 cores. My execution of an R report will use one core. So if I want that to be a little faster, higher megahertz is a plus. If I have a trade-off between more cores and more megahertz, a little more megahertz is a plus extra cache on the chip. If I have a lot of users on a system, then cores becomes more important. Because if I've got 16 cores and 60 users, it'll spread those 60 users across those cores. Now, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. You'd be like, yeah, but isn't our clerk and our report running on the PC? We started that way, but we're going to end up somewhere different. So whatever's running on the server, well, let me back up. If you're running GI server, which I'm going to talk more about, GI server, we said this yesterday, the R clerks and the R reports are running where? On the host. It's like Unix again. It's running on the host. The only thing running on the PC is the FP client, the filePro GI client. That's what runs on the PC. All the actual work is being done on the server. So the server will spread your stuff across multiple cores. You don't need to go nuts. filePro is a very efficient database. The fixed length nature of filePro's data files, index sequential access method, ISAM style, is incredibly fast. If I want record number 100, what does filePro have to do to get it? What's the record length? Times 100 is the byte that I need to go to get it. Boom, I don't even need it. If I know the record number, I don't even need an index. And the indexes, just tell me what record number to go get to. And indexes are relatively small. So compared to what SQL has to do, where going up and down, jumping around in one big giant puddle of data to find things, filePro is incredibly fast. But all of that can happen on the server. How much memory you need is going to be based on your number of users and whether you're doing remote desktop systems or not. Remote desktop services, we'll talk more about that. My typical servers have 32 gig of memory these days. 64 is not much more money, so I might be able to spring for that. And they'll typically have maybe one processor with 8 or 16 cores in it at 2.8 to 3.2 gigahertz. That's pretty much where a lot of it is right now. Network speed. You remember running coax from computer to computer to computer for Ethernet and those little T adapters? I told you I'll take you back memory lane a little bit. I mean, I literally have holes in my office through the walls between the offices so that we could run serial daisy chain Ethernet. At what speed was that? 10 megabits. Well, that's a lot faster than the multi-modems from Multitech with 9600 baud that we used before that. But that was our first Ethernet. As things have grown, we're on gigabit, but I've got clients that are still running 100 megabit to the desktop, even though all the PCs are gigabit capable and the server's gigabit capable, but they haven't replaced the switches. I want to tell them to go down to Staples and just buy a $150 switch. It's hard for infrastructure upgrades to take place. If you're running traditional map drive FilePro, all that data is going over the network. So beefing up that pipe will reduce latency and improve speed. So you want to be on as fast a network as you can. If you're doing remote desktop sessions, it doesn't matter as much. And we'll talk more about that. The NIC and the port, the network interface card. Our servers typically come with 4 NICs, and we'll bond them together to get 2 gigabytes, or if they're 10 gig NICs, we'll bond them and get, we have one server that's got 40 gigabit pipe because we bonded 4 NICs together. So there's some configurations that you can do to take advantage of multiple network cards. But make sure that your network is reasonable. How many of you use DHCP versus fixed IP addresses on your systems? I'm sorry, I loaded. DHCP, fixed IP. Okay. I use both, depends on the situation. But I've got counties that have multiple fixed IP networks and it's just a mess. You need to have an organized structure. And if you're gonna run out of 255 addresses and that's a problem, ask me afterwards how to deal with it. It's called supernetting. And all you gotta do is change that 255, 255, 255.0 on the end to something different, and you can have 512 addresses or 1,024 and not create separate, overlapping, parallel, messed up networks. Your network is the communication link between everything. It's gotta be done right. Don't go to sleep. Did you get your coffee? That's not what I mean. What I mean is, don't let your server go to sleep. Make sure that the server is set to performance mode and that your PCs are set the same. Especially this is an issue with PCs, because the PCs oftentimes will default to eco-friendly mode and they'll go into hibernation if they don't work. What happens to your stuff that's running on the PC when it goes into hibernation mode? Microsoft puts it off on the disk as a temporary thing, and when it comes back up again, it may not work because we've lost our connection to the network. Our network connections may have timed out or disconnected. Microsoft doesn't think that's a big deal. If it's working in Word, they'll reconnect and then reopen the document again. But you know what a file handle is, right? If I'm running on a PC and I have a file handle to a file up on a server, and you take down the connection, the file handle is lost. And once it reconnects, it might give it a different file handle. Have you ever come back to your computers in the morning and found that you're sitting in filePro screen, it looks completely alive and fine. Of course, this is Windows, not Unix. And you try to do something and it gives a system error, crash, can't find the D drive. Why did it do that? It did it because the drive's not there anymore. It may actually be back again, but the handles have all been lost. So you've got to make sure that your settings aren't going to allow any kind of a timeout. We do set a scheduled task at night to generally close all shares and reconnect, restart them. We also tend to restart the GI service, not because the GI service needs it, because I want to boot people out of the system that didn't log off at the end of the day. And it's not a brute force way to do it, even in a map drive environment.